The farm has been in my family for many generations. My great-grandfather started it with a pair of oxen and a determination to make something out of nothing. Over time, the farm grew modestly, sure, but enough to sustain the generations that followed. We didn't just work this land, we lived it. Every fence post and tree, every barn beam and tractor wheel, carries the weight of our family's history. For me, this farm isn't just dirt and grass. It's where I learned to drive on a rusty old truck that barely held together. It's where I spent endless summer afternoons in the fields with my dad, sweating under the sun and listening to him explain the way soil talks to you, if you're patient enough to listen. It's where my mom used to call us in for dinner, her voice carrying across the open fields like a song. The farm is surrounded by what used to be other small farms. My neighbors are families who've lived here just as long as mine has. People like the McKinleys, whose dairy cows you can hear mooing softly on cool mornings, or the Parkers, who always invite the whole community over for a barbecue after the harvest season. We've always had an unspoken bond. Out here, you don't just wave to your neighbor. You lend them your tractor when theirs breaks down. You share seeds when the market prices skyrocket. You look out for each other. But things started to change. Slowly at first and then all at once. Economic hardships have always been a fact of life in farming. But the last few decades hit especially hard. One by one, families sold their land. Sometimes it was because of rising costs or declining yields. Other times, it was because younger generations didn't want to take over the farm. Whatever the reason, developers swooped in like vultures. At first, the changes didn't seem too bad. A couple of houses went up here and there, nothing too disruptive. But soon, those houses turned into full-blown subdivisions. Rows of identical homes with perfectly manicured lawns and driveways wide enough to park an RV. With the subdivisions came the homeowners associations. These HOAs were like little kingdoms, complete with their own sets of laws that dictated everything from the color of your mailbox to how high your grass could grow. They were alien to us farmers. Out here, we live by the rhythms of nature, not a 40-page rulebook. At first, we coexisted uneasily. They stayed on their side of the line and we stayed on ours. But as the years went on, it became clear that the HOAs weren't content with their boundaries. They wanted more. And as the subdivisions grew closer to my land, I started to feel like a lone island in an encroaching sea of concrete and vinyl siding. It was a hot summer afternoon when I first met Karen. I was in the barn, pitching hay into the loft, when I noticed someone walking up the dirt path to my house. She was out of place immediately. High heels on a farm, a crisp white blouse and a clipboard in her hand. She looked like she'd taken a wrong turn on her way to a corporate meeting. I stepped outside and met her halfway up the path. She introduced herself with a too bright smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. She told me her name, but for the purposes of this story, I'll call her Karen. Fitz, trust me. Karen wasted no time getting to her point. She was from the HOA of the new subdivision down the road. According to her, my farm was now under their jurisdiction. I blinked at her, trying to process the audacity of that statement. My property has never been part of their district. It's been family-owned for over a century, long before their cookie-cutter houses were even a thought. She smiled again, that same fake smile, and started explaining how my land could serve the community. The HOA had big plans for a commercial development nearby, a couple of shops, a cafe, maybe even a boutique grocery store. They wanted to buy a section of my farm, the field closest to the subdivision, to turn it into a parking lot. Parking lot. I could feel my jaw tighten as she spoke. She talked to me like I was a child, using slow, deliberate words, as though farming made me too simple to understand city folk ideas. She mentioned how modernization would benefit me, how selling would make things easier. When she implied that farming wasn't exactly lucrative these days, I had to grit my teeth to keep from snapping. I told her firmly that my land was not for sale. She acted surprised, as if she couldn't fathom why anyone would pass up her oh-so-generous offer. Then she dropped the bombshell. According to her, the HOA had already claimed my land. She said something about zoning changes and legal documents, as though the lines on a map could erase the history and hard work my family had poured into this place. That was the end of my patience. I told her to leave and made it clear she wouldn't be getting anything from me. She left, her heels clicking against the gravel, but not before making one final comment about how progress waits for no one. That evening, I called up a few of my neighbors to let them know what had happened. It didn't take long for me to realize Karen had been busy. She'd visited the Parkers, the McKinleys, and a few others, all with the same pitch. Sell your land or the HOA will take it. Most of us were outraged, but there was fear too. Karen had been throwing around big numbers, and some of the older farmers were tempted. A few even considered selling, not because they wanted to, but because they felt like they didn't have a choice. The idea that the HOA could use legal loopholes to claim our land had everyone on edge. We held an impromptu meeting at the McKinley's barn that weekend. It felt like something out of an old movie. Farmers sitting in a circle of folding chairs, sharing coffee and worries. Some of the younger folks were fired up, ready to fight. Others, especially the older generation, seemed resigned, like they'd seen this kind of thing before and knew how it ended. "We can't let them push us out," one of the Parkers said, slamming his fist on the arm of his chair. "This is our land." "But what if they're right about the zoning?" someone else countered. "What if they already have the legal upper hand?" The room fell silent after that. No one wanted to say it, but we all knew the truth. The HOAs had money, lawyers, and the kind of influence that could make life very difficult for people like us. It wasn't just about losing land, it was about losing a way of life. Karen's visit left me uneasy. Her smug confidence, her claims about zoning changes, it all pointed to one thing. This wasn't over. I had a sinking feeling that the HOA wasn't going to take no for an answer. And as much as I wanted to believe that my family's legacy was untouchable, I couldn't shake the thought that Karen and her clipboard were just the beginning. That night, as I sat on the porch and looked out over the fields, the knot in my stomach tightened. The stars were out, scattered across the sky like a promise, but all I could think about was how fragile it all felt. This land had survived droughts, floods, and market crashes. But could it survive an HOA? I wasn't sure. There's a rhythm to life on a farm, even when you step away from it for a few days. The seasons dictate the work, and you trust that your careful planning will hold things together in your absence. That trust is essential. It's what allows you to step back, even for a moment, from the constant demands of the land. But trust, as I learned the hard way, is fragile. Every year, my family and I take a trip to visit my wife's relatives for the holidays. It's a tradition we've kept since the kids were little. A chance for them to see their cousins and for us to recharge before diving into another year of farm life. For me, it's also a rare opportunity to let my guard down, knowing that the farm is in good hands. Before we left, I made my usual arrangements. I asked my neighbor, Sam, to keep an eye on things while we were gone. Sam's been my friend for years, and he knows the farm almost as well as I do. He promised to check in daily, feed the animals, and make sure everything was running smoothly. I never doubted he'd handle things, he always had before. As we loaded the car and set off for our 14-day trip, I felt a rare sense of ease. The farm was quiet, the fields bare from the last harvest, and the animals tucked away for the winter. Everything seemed in its place. What I didn't know was that Karen had been watching and waiting, biding her time for an opportunity. Karen was nothing if not persistent. After I'd firmly turned down her proposal during our last encounter, I thought she might back off, at least for a while. But Karen wasn't the type to take no for an answer. She'd been keeping an eye on the farm, waiting for the perfect moment to make her move. When she saw the place quiet and unoccupied, she seized her chance. What Karen didn't know, or maybe didn't care about, was that her actions would set off a chain of events more damaging than I could have imagined. When we returned from our trip, I knew something was wrong the moment we turned onto the dirt road leading to the house. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but as we drew closer, the sickening truth came into focus. Heavy machinery was scattered across the property, and my fields, the same fields my great-grandfather had once plowed by hand, were unrecognizable. The air smelled of fresh concrete and diesel fumes. Patches of rich, dark soil had been replaced by gray slabs of pavement that stretched across several acres. Near the center of the mess, my old irrigation pump was gone. It had been a lifeline for the farm, keeping the crops alive during the hottest summers. Now it was a heap of twisted metal shoved aside, replaced by the foundations of what looked like a large parking lot. The sight turned my stomach. I slammed the car into park and jumped out, my heart pounding in my chest. My wife called after me, but I didn't stop. I ran straight toward the machines, my boots crunching on the gravel that had been dumped over my land like an insult. Standing near the center of the destruction was Karen, clipboard in hand, barking orders to a crew of construction workers. She looked completely at ease, as if she were overseeing a project in her own backyard. When she spotted me, she didn't flinch or falter. Instead, she smiled, as if she'd been expecting me. The sight of my land in ruins hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just dirt and equipment. They'd torn apart my family's history, our livelihood, our identity. The fence along the southern field wasn't just a boundary. It was a part of our story. My grandfather had built that fence with his brothers, using wood they'd milled themselves. Over the years, my dad and I had replaced posts, mended rails, and shared countless conversations leaning against it. And now it was gone. Ripped out, splintered into pieces, and tossed aside like it didn't matter. I stood there, staring at the mess, feeling a mix of rage and grief so intense I could barely breathe. This wasn't just an attack on my property. It was an attack on everything my family had worked for, everything we stood for. I stormed over to Karen, my fists clenched at my sides. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger. Karen didn't even blink. "It's not your property anymore," she said calmly, tapping her clipboard for emphasis. "The HOA has claimed this land. We've already started construction on the parking lot." Her words were so absurd, so utterly detached from reality, that I almost laughed. Instead, I took a deep breath, trying to rein in my temper. "This is my farm," I said through gritted teeth. "It's been in my family for generations. You have no right, no legal right, to do this." Karen waved a hand dismissively. "The land was abandoned. The HOA has every right to repurpose it for the benefit of the community." Before I could respond, one of the construction workers approached, looking uneasy. Ma'am," he said, glancing between Karen and me, "you told us this was HOA property. Is this guy the owner?" Karen's expression faltered for a split second before she recovered. "It's a legal matter," she said smoothly. "We're handling it." I turned to the worker. "You're on private property," I said firmly. "I'm the owner, and I didn't authorize this. You're trespassing." The man looked at his crew, then back at me. "We'll stop until this gets sorted," he said reluctantly. Karen tried to argue, but the crew was clearly uncomfortable. They began shutting down the machines one by one. Karen glared at me as if I were the one in the wrong. When the machines finally fell silent and the workers left, I took stock of the damage. The scale of destruction was worse than I'd initially realized. They'd poured concrete over some of my most fertile soil, the land I'd depended on for crops. It wasn't just a temporary setback. It would take years, maybe decades, to restore the soil to its original state, if that was even possible. The loss of the orchard cut even deeper. My grandparents had planted those apple trees. Over the years, the orchard had become more than just a source of fruit. It was a place where family memories were made. Every autumn, we'd gather beneath its branches, baskets in hand, to pick apples while the kids ran around laughing and climbing the trees. My dad used to say those trees were a testament to what hard work and patience could build. He spent his last years pruning their branches and teaching me how to recognize when the fruit was ready for harvest. My kids loved those trees too. Now all of that was gone. Seeing it was like losing my family all over again. It wasn't just an insult to the land. It was an assault on the heart of everything we'd built here. That night, as I sat on the porch staring out at the wreckage of my farm, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Karen or her HOA get away with this. This land was more than just dirt and trees. It was my family's history, my livelihood, my identity. They'd underestimated me, thinking I'd roll over and let them pave my life away. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The first thing I did the next morning was call my lawyer, Pete. He listened quietly as I explained everything. The damage to my land, the destruction of the orchard, the lies Karen had told to justify her actions. This is a clear case of trespassing and property damage, Pete said. We're also looking at destruction of cultural landmarks and malicious intent. We're filing a cease and desist letter immediately, and I want you to report this to the police. I didn't hesitate. Filing the report felt like taking the first real step toward justice. The officers who came to the farm took one look at the destruction and assured me they'd open an investigation. Hearing them confirm what I already knew, that Karen had broken the law, felt like a small victory, but I knew the battle was just beginning. What I didn't expect was how much support I'd get from the community. Word spread quickly, and neighbors started showing up at the farm to offer their help. The McKinleys showed up with their tractor and helped haul away debris. The Parkers used their connections to contact local officials and push for a faster investigation. And even old Mr. Johnson stopped by to offer legal advice. "You're not alone in this," Mrs. Parker said firmly. "They've pushed us around long enough." Hearing that solidarity gave me the strength to keep going. This wasn't just about my farm anymore. It was about standing up for all of us who called this land home. Pete wasted no time filing charges against Karen. Trespassing, destruction of private property, and cultural vandalism were just the beginning. The police investigation added weight to our case, and soon enough, we were facing Karen and the HOA in court. Karen's defense was as arrogant as it was absurd. She argued that her actions were for the greater good of the community, insisting that the parking lot would benefit everyone. She doubled down on her claim that the land was abandoned, ignoring the fact that I'd been living and working on it for years. Her lawyer tried to spin her actions as a misunderstanding, but the truth was about to unravel. The turning point came when members of the construction crew testified. They revealed that Karen had told them the farm was abandoned and under HOA control. Their testimony, combined with property records proving my ownership, completely dismantled Karen's case. She'd lied to the crew, to the HOA, and to the court. When the judge handed down the ruling, it was a moment I'll never forget. Karen was found guilty on all charges. Her sentence included 1 year in prison, 2 years of probation, and fines that added up to $281,000. Of that, $75,000 was allocated for restoring the farm, $6,000 for lost crop revenue, $125,000 in criminal fines, and $75,000 for the destruction of cultural landmarks. As the judge read the sentence, Karen sat stone-faced, her confidence finally shattered. Justice had been served, but the fight wasn't over yet. In the weeks following the trial, the HOA scrambled to distance itself from Karen. They released a statement claiming she'd acted independently and without their authorization. It was a transparent attempt to save face, but the damage to their reputation had already been done. Karen became a cautionary tale, a symbol of the dangers of HOA overreach and unchecked arrogance. For me, the focus shifted to rebuilding. The process of restoring the land was daunting. The concrete had to be broken up and hauled away, the soil treated for contamination, and the fields regraded. The orchard, which had been a source of pride and joy for generations, would take years to reestablish. Still, I wasn't deterred. Every step of the restoration felt like reclaiming a piece of what Karen had tried to take from me. Neighbors pitched in where they could, whether it was hauling debris, planting trees, or simply lending a word of encouragement. It reminded me why I'd fought so hard in the first place. This farm wasn't just mine. It was part of a community that refused to back down. As I reflect on everything that's happened, I can't help but feel a mix of anger, gratitude, and resolve. Karen's actions were a violation of everything my family had worked for, but they also brought our community closer together. Her downfall stands as a warning to anyone who underestimates the strength of rural communities and the importance of protecting what's ours. The farm isn't the same as it was before, but it's still here. And as long as I'm breathing, I'll make sure it stays that way. The scars on the land will heal with time, just as the ones in my heart will.